Welcome to Strange Truths and Tall Tales, the product of Newfoundland podcast. This is the place for anyone who's into Newfoundland stories, history, and culture. I'm Robert, your host and guide through the curious, the legendary, and well, sometimes even the downright strange. You might know me from my writing at Product of Newfoundland, where I dive deep into the stories of this island. Here at the podcast, I try to bring those stories to life in a new way. Everything from folklore to forgotten truth to the quirky traditions that make us who we are. But tonight things are going to get a little spookier. Because this is a Halloween episode, and I've got a couple of seasonally appropriate stories for you. One that still haunts the streets of St. John's, and a true story that terrifies me when I imagine what it must have been like for the central character. So grab a cup of tea, settle in, and let's explore the stories that make Newfoundland what it is, one chilling tale at a time. You're traveling through the fog, and just ahead is an island of mystery, mayhem, and myth. Your next stop, Newfoundland, and these are its strange truths and tall tales. You know, just about every corner of Old St. John's has a ghost story tied to it. But few are as mysterious or as chilling as the haunting of J.W. Foran's Atlantic Hotel. Now, the Atlantic Hotel wasn't just any old inn. It opened back in 1885, and people called it the most awesome building in St. John's. And really, they weren't wrong. Picture it. The hotel sat between Duckworth and Water Streets, opposite King's Road, right in the thick of things. Inside, it was the height of luxury for the time. It had steam heat, a passenger elevator, and speaking tubes that carried voices through the hall. Gas lights glowed in every room. There were hot and cold baths, laundry services, and a hairdresser. They even had a telephone, which, in the late 1880s, was no small thing. Foran promised the hotel could compare with the best in England or America, and for a while it did. The Atlantic was the place to be in St. John's, but it didn't last long. The Great Fire of 1892 gutted the building after only a few short years. Still, in its brief life, it left behind one of the strangest tales of haunting ever told in the city. A story that begins, as many haunting tales do, on what should have been an ordinary night. It was late. Most of the guests were asleep when a strange sound broke the quiet. A knocking. Not a polite little tap-tap, but a hard, fast pounding, like someone trapped behind a door, desperate to get out. Guests came stumbling into the hall in their nightclothes, only to find staff as mystified as they were. The knocks echoed up and down the corridor until finally they traced it to a room on the top floor, a room that was supposed to be empty. They opened the door, and the knocking stopped. Inside, nothing, no one, just silence. A few uneasy laughs followed, and people went back to bed. But more than one person had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the timbers, every gust of wind sounded a little too much like that strange knocking again. By morning, in the light of day, it all seemed foolish. It was, after all, just a strange noise in a busy building, probably a loose shutter or a draft, something simple. But that theory didn't hold for long, because the next night, it happened again. Same sound, same room, same result. The moment they opened the door, the noise stopped. By the third night, people were bordering on terrified. The knocking came again, louder, faster, more furious, like fists slamming the wood. And then, just as before, the moment the latch to that top-floor room clicked open, silence. Now the whispers started. Some said it was a ghost trapped in that upstairs room. Others swore it was an omen. A few loyal guests, skeptics, decided they'd get to the bottom of it once and for all. They decided to form a watch party. They stayed up through the night, guarding the top floor. Hour after hour, but nothing happened. When morning came, they decided the knocking must have been a prank, the mischief of one of the hotel guests who was too afraid to act again with so much scrutiny. Not everyone was convinced, but the story died down all the same, and more importantly, the knocking stopped. 6 months passed. Then one evening, a stranger checked into the hotel. There were no vacancies except for that room. The stranger didn't know the story, and the clerk didn't see any harm in handing him the key. After all, it had been quiet for months, and it was probably nothing anyway, right? Then, around 11 o'clock, it started again. But this time, it wasn't just knocking. It was a barrage, a thunder of fists and boots against the door so violent the walls shook. Guests screamed, staff rushed upstairs, and when they reached the room, the door was hanging open. As they crossed the threshold, the noise stopped. Inside, they found the stranger, laid out on the bed as though asleep. His boots were still on, his coat still buttoned, as if he'd just laid down to rest for a moment. But when they called to him, he didn't stir. When they stepped closer, they realized why. The color had drained from his face. His eyes were half open, staring at nothing. Whatever had come for him that night had done its work quickly. He was dead. Doctors said it was a hemorrhage, something sudden and violent. But people whispered other things. They wondered, had the knocking frightened him to death? Or worse, had he somehow answered it? Had he opened some passage that should have stayed shut? No one could say. Frightened, they left his body in the room. When the undertakers arrived the next morning, the knocking started again. Loud, relentless, pounding through the halls until they carried his body away. And then, silence. Forever. The man was never identified, though some whispered he'd been a hangman in Canada responsible for untold deaths. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the city, and the room was sealed off, never rented again. Not long after, the Great Fire swept through St. John's and destroyed Foran's Grand Hotel. Today, the Sir Humphrey Gilbert building stands where it once did. Before his death, Foran was said to tell the story of the strange knocking himself, helping it to live on in the city's folklore. As for what really happened, well, people are as mystified now as the hotel guests of the 1880s. Some say it was a summons from beyond, a call that maybe only a hangman could answer. A call to a man who, time and time again, had ushered the living to the world of the dead. And maybe that door he'd opened so often, maybe it could swing both ways. Maybe he'd allowed something to come back. And if they're right, maybe what stirred that night still drifts through the fog and shadows of Old St. John's. And perhaps other things from beyond are waiting, maybe in another hotel room, in another room, hovering at the threshold, waiting for their knock to be heard, waiting for the right one to give them passage to the wrong side. That ghost story, The Knocking in the Night, belongs to the folklore of St. John's, and I think I understand why it persists. It's the perfect mix of mystery and creepy. There's just enough info to make you wonder what exactly is going on there. This next story, it's not a legend at all. This part is true, and it's tragic, and for me, terrifying. It happened in 1887, 5 years before the Great Fire, when the Atlantic Hotel was still one of the grandest buildings in St. John's. And among its staff was a young man named William Shea. He was 27 years old, a porter, known for being hardworking, cheerful, and always ready to lend a hand. He had a wife, 2 small children, and a future full of promise. But in the early hours of Sunday, November 27, 1887, William's life was cut tragically short, not by ghosts or curses, but by a simple, terrible mistake. That night, hotel owner J.W. Foran made his usual rounds. Guests were turning in, gas lights were dimmed, and William was finishing his last chores. Foran told him to call it a night, and then he himself went upstairs to bed. By about 3 a.m, the hotel had gotten still, until Mrs. Foran stirred. She thought she heard footsteps below their room, then a faint hum of the elevator moving. Moments later, a sharp cry rang out, and then a crash. Foran ran downstairs in his nightclothes, his wife following close behind with a lamp. At the bottom of the elevator shaft, they found William, broken, barely breathing. He'd fallen more than 30 feet. A doctor and priest were called right away, but there was nothing they could do. William's wife was brought to the hotel, and she stayed with him until he quietly slipped away. Later, the staff pieced together what must have happened. William had taken the elevator up, likely to clean a pair of boots for 2 late-arriving guests, a job he always did before turning in. He must have thought he'd reached the top floor of the hotel where the elevator would stop. He was really 1 level lower. As he stepped off the elevator, it continued on upward. Later, when he came to go back down, he opened the door, assuming the car was waiting for him, but it wasn't. He must have reached for the handle, opened the door, and stepped forward, expecting solid floor beneath him, but instead, there was only open air. For the briefest moment, he must have known what was happening, but it was too late. Gravity took him. He fell silently through the dark, past the black walls of the elevator shaft, until the fall ended with a single terrible crash on the ground below. And then the Atlantic Hotel was quiet again. It was a horrifying thought, especially for hotel staff who could easily envision themselves in that terrifying fall. Shea's death cast a pall on the hotel. Staff moved softly through the halls and guests spoke in whispers. That night, William's body was taken to his home on Barnes Road, where it was waked. Mr. Foran gathered donations for his widow and children, and the people of St. John's gave generously. It was a small act of mercy in a city that knew sorrow too well. It's strange, isn't it, how a place like the Atlantic Hotel can vanish from the cityscape after only existing for a handful of years and still hold a place in our imaginations almost a century and a half later. The ghostly knocking might be just a story, a tale spun from imagination. But what happened to William Shea? Well, that was the real horror of the Atlantic Hotel. Not a curse, not a haunting, just a simple misstep in the dark. A mistake anyone could have made. It's terrifying to think about. And that's it for this short episode. Thank you for listening to Strange Truths and Tall Tales. If you like these Halloween stories, you can find more strange history, folklore, and ghostly tales on the Product of Newfoundland blog. And don't forget to follow the show for more tangly, timeless, and totally true-ish Newfoundland stories. Oh, and there's more Halloween content on the way. I look forward to seeing you then.